Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to speak with Professor Robert McChesney. He specializes in the history and political economy of communication and the role media play in democratic and capitalist society. He co-founded Free Press, a national media reform organization, and he recently co-wrote with John Nichols the book, People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. Robert, welcome to the Keiser Report.
My pleasure to be here.
All right, first, your assessment of the role the media has played, not only giving Donald Trump several billion in free airtime, while at the same time largely ignoring Bernie Sanders for much of the race. Your thoughts?
Well, the media has been really a central factor in the presidential race in the United States in 2016. The news media are always a factor, and they've been studied and discussed and understood as central to the process. But this year, their role is really quite striking. As you mentioned, in the case of Donald Trump, he was by one and all regarded as a fringe sort of joke candidate initially. When he first announced, he wasn't taken seriously at all. He had run before in the past, and he'd never amounted to anything. And he's a hyper-intensive, narcissistic publicity hound. So it looked like he was just trying to drum up more publicity so he could make billions more hawking his products and with these reality television shows. But he was able to work the media as no other candidate ever has to basically take it over and have them cover him endlessly throughout the second half of 2015 up to the primaries. And then once he started polling very high and winning primary elections, he had to continue to get ample coverage. On the other hand, in the Democratic side, what was striking is that Bernie Sanders, when he announced, was like Trump, regarded as a not serious candidate whatsoever, as somebody that did not have a chance. But unlike the Republican side, there were 15 contenders who were all mainstream people from governorships or senatorships and taken seriously as having a legitimate shot at the nomination. On the Democratic side, there was only one real candidate. That was Hillary Clinton. And by the middle of 2015, it was acknowledged that she was going to be the nominee in the corporate media and on NPR, the mainstream press of the United States. And that has never changed in their coverage. Bernie Sanders was first ignored entirely as someone not to be taken seriously, despite the fact he was drawing what were unprecedented crowds throughout the second half of 2015 across the United States, tens of thousands of people, and drawing enormous support, especially among young people, people who had not been very active in American politics in generations. And the reason was, the best we can tell, is that Bernie Sanders' politics were to the left of the mainstream. He was a self-described democratic socialist who was calling for a platform that in Western Europe would be recognized as one of moderate social democracy: single-payer health insurance, free college education, support for having labor unions. Nothing especially radical by global standards, but in the United States, where corporations dominate the political discourse, what he said was way outside the boundaries of what was considered legitimate, and therefore he was largely dismissed.
All right, Robert, let me jump in for a second now. I wanted to ask you something kind of, I guess you could say, remarkable developed during all this. Les Moonves, who heads up CBS, at a convention of media professionals, made the comment basically about Trump's campaign, saying that it's a circus, but we're making a lot of money on this circus. And so you saw kind of a naked opportunism there. And these airwaves, these are the public airwaves. And yet they're stifling the debate. So, and the corporate interests are overriding the democratic process in what can only be described in a somewhat heinous way. Your thoughts?
Well, you're right. I mean, the reason why NPR and the corporate news media have covered Donald Trump extensively from the very beginning was purely commercial. He drew audience for them. He says outrageous things all the time. He's very entertaining to watch compared to most politicians. So that it was cheap, easy money to make. You don't have to do any journalism. You just put a camera on the guy, let him talk, and you draw audiences and you sell advertising. And like Les Moonves says, it's great for the bottom line. In fact, I think you could safely say that our corporate news media, our journalists, NPR, PBS, the mainstream of U.S. journalism, by and large, almost entirely despises Donald Trump or despises the prospect of his being president. They regard him as a fool and no one to be trusted with the White House. They covered him not because they were promoting him or whatever his politics might be, but because he was great for the bottom line. He was cheap and easy to cover. Just put a camera on him. And they're living with that. On the other hand, though, I think it's fair to say in Hillary Clinton's case, they really like Hillary Clinton. She is the candidate of mainstream media, corporate America, Wall Street. She's someone they really trust, they like, and she's taken very seriously, and her viewpoint is taken very seriously across the cable television networks where news is very important, like CNN and MSNBC, and also at AP, New York Times, Washington Post. You would think by watching the media I just named, and I'd throw in NPR, National Public Radio, that their news stories and the way they ask their questions and what they cover and don't cover was almost determined directly by Hillary Clinton's campaign staff, not by independent journalists.
Let's change gears for a second here. So the election, of course, very much about the economy, and let's talk about the economy here. At Davos in 2014, Eric Schmidt of Google warned of a defining moment as middle-class jobs are lost to robots. Now, is that moment here, and do any of the candidates or the parties have any kind of credible response, Robert McChesney?
Well, that's right. In the new book I've written with John Nichols, People Get Ready, is about the wave of automation and artificial intelligence. It's just beginning now. We're in the first innings of it, about which people like Eric Schmidt, and really, I would say almost a consensus now in the business and engineering community, agree will wipe out tens of millions of jobs within the next 2 decades worldwide and in the United States. I mean, it will be a serial blow. And Eric Schmidt said the issue of unemployment, underemployment is about to become and will be for the next 2 or 3 decades the number one political issue in the world. And the question is, in the United States, are there going to be candidates who are going to deal with all the extraordinary implications of the technological revolution that we're entering right now and deal with it in a way that will best benefit the people of the country? Well, no one's really discussing it. No one. The closest we get to Sanders, who's made unemployment a central issue, and the need to have public works, New Deal or social democratic style, to create jobs, good-paying jobs in the United States and to boost the economy. He's come the closest, and that probably is the best possible approach at this point. But the other candidates, for the most part, all live in the pipe world that if Google gets rich and Amazon gets rich, what's good for them is good for the human race, and new jobs will magically appear thanks to entrepreneurship and other new technologies. I think they're pretty much with their head in the sand. And that's not really a controversial position among people who study these technologies and how they're changing jobs. I think the conclusion everyone reaches is the government's going to have to play an enormous, large position addressing the jobs crisis and just addressing the robotics challenge that's coming. It's not something you can just sit back and let the magic market figure out on its own, because the market has no way of dealing with this.
You know, you say in your book, Robert, that most of the world's population is disposable, irrelevant from the standpoint of capital. Of course, it gets back into this trend of robotics, but, you know, to also say that this has been true for a number of decades now, because since the introduction of the financialization going back to the deregulation of the 1980s, the elites can simply print money over there at the central bank. They don't need the taxable revenues. The U.S. entire, they pick up $3 trillion a year in taxes, but, Wall Street and the central banks are printing hundreds of trillions of dollars around the world, or certainly tens of trillions of dollars in the U.S. In other words, work has become expendable because of this phenomenon of money printing. So you don't need taxes. You don't need the work. This has been going on already for a couple of decades. Is that a fair assessment in your view, or is that not doesn't fit into how you see things?
That doesn't fit into how we see things. I think the ability for central banks to print money in the United States or worldwide is a very interesting issue. That really has very little to do with the elimination of jobs, because the reason why central banks would print money is so people could buy products produced by labor. So in theory, the ability to print money and loosen the money supply could lead to an increase in demand, which would lead to an increase in employment. You can't throw dollar bills at a machine and make it work. You need human labor traditionally. The real reason why we're losing human labor is not the ability of central banks to print up money, but rather it's the fact that the digital revolution has made literally a quantum leap in power over the last 2 decades from where it began, in the post-war years. And it's almost boggles the human imagination to grasp what computers can now do. Robotics today, to put it in a sharp example, a decade ago, the idea of a driverless vehicle or driverless cars was considered almost science fiction, something that would be very difficult for robots to do or for artificial intelligence. Well, today in 2016, driverless vehicles are old technology. They're done. We've got that down. Now it's just a political fight to get humans off the road and let the machines take over. They'll do a much better job. That's already a given with the technology. But that also leads to spectacular issues for employment. The number one job in the American economy, by far, for men, is driving a vehicle, be it a truck, a bus, a taxi cab, a delivery vehicle, one thing or another. Driving a vehicle is the number one job for men in the American economy. And we have the technology now and the business incentive right now to eliminate all those jobs. It's right there. And if we wipe those millions and millions of jobs off the blackboard, what's left? Where are those men and their families going to go? Well, this economic system has no answer for that. Zero. And that's really the great political crisis we're steering right down the gun barrel at.
I take your point that printing money, would stimulate demand and to drive the economy, but it hasn't stimulated demand. In fact, demand is down and wages are down, so that policy, money printing, is not working, and yet it continues unabated and exacerbates through various quantitative easing programs and other types of guarantees. And it's not having the effect of raising wages enough to create an economic stimulus in any way, and yet it continues unabated. Basically, a failed policy. It just is continued.
Let me comment on that if I could.
Yeah.
I don't think it's really a failed policy. I don't know what other policy, given the constraints faced by central banks and the political pressures on them. I think the failed system here is capitalism. Capitalism is in a period of prolonged secular stagnation. And this was once a largely radical idea. This is no longer a radical idea. This is an idea people like Lawrence Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, chief economist for President Obama in his first term, he's now embraced this and acknowledges that the global system, and especially the U.S. system, is in a period of very slow growth, long term. The decade of the 2010s, our current decade, has the lowest growth rates in the United States and worldwide since the 1930s.
All right, Robert, we're going to have to cut it off there. If you can stay on for another segment, that would be great. But we got to say goodbye for this segment. Thanks for being on the show.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Robert McChesney. Go get his book, People Get Ready. This is what it looks like. The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. If you'd like to get in touch with us, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to return to our discussion with Professor Robert McChesney. He specializes in the history and political economy of communication and the role media plays in democratic and capitalist society. He co-founded Free Press, a national media reform organization, and he recently co-wrote with John Nichols this book, People Get Ready, The Fight Against a Jobless Economy and a Citizenless Democracy. Robert, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's a real pleasure.
All right, so let's pick up where we left off in our previous discussion. So the setup was that you've got the economy collapsing, robots are taking over, and we got to the point where we were kind of talking about capitalism itself. And so your comment was, capitalism itself has failed. So maybe pick it up on that point and expound on that a little bit.
Well, I think that the modern world capitalist system, especially the one in the United States that I'm most familiar with, that variant of it, is in a period of prolonged slow growth, underemployment, declining employment, growing inequality and poverty, which happens when you have a slow growth economy. And not just unemployed people, but literally $2 trillion in capital that corporations possess. They're not investing. They're sitting on tons of money they can't find profitable investments for. And this is why the robotics and artificial intelligence problem becomes so pronounced, because it's not like it's coming to a capitalism that's hitting on all cylinders. It's coming to a capitalism that's severely troubled. And now we've had new technologies that are going to wipe out tens of millions more jobs over the next 10 or 20 years with no replacement in sight. That's more downward pressure on wages as there are more workers competing for fewer jobs. That's more inequality. That's more poverty. And most importantly, that's more political upheaval. And I think the point of our book and our argument is that this is not a technological issue. This is not an economic issue. It is ultimately a political issue. And what we know from history is that when societies enter periods of pronounced unemployment, it leads to periods of invariably of tremendous political upheaval. And that's why we call the book People Get Ready, because we have to get ready, because how we resolve the political crisis that's coming will go a long way towards the shaping the next chapter in human history.
All right, let's talk about a case study here. Kodak versus Instagram. So how many did each employ? What's the difference? Tell us about the future. Robert, tell us about this.
Well, Kodak is a company. It's one of the great American companies, the photography company that made cameras and processed film, and had hundreds of thousands of employees at its peak just as recently as 25 years ago, paid union wages, which in America in that period meant a living wage, a high-quality living wage usually, so you could actually send your kids to college and you'd have a vacation, you could own your own home, things that are increasingly very difficult to do for an American worker. But it was sort of a representative of American capitalism in the post-war era at its best. Well, now along comes Instagram, the technological revolution, that pretty much wipes out a lot of what Kodak has done. And Kodak basically filed for bankruptcy a few years ago, and basically now is just a shell of the company it once was. It's resumed operations, but it's just a small fraction of what it once did. And Instagram, the company that replaced Kodak to a large extent, was bought by Facebook for $1 billion. And at the time of Kodak's bankruptcy and Instagram's sale to Facebook, Instagram had 12 employees versus over 100,000. And that was because people were doing their own photography. They're developing it themselves. All that labor had been eliminated by the digital technologies. And that's just some of its labor. Some of it's the consumer taking over part of the work and not being paid for it. At any rate, that's just a small example of what's taking place all across the economy. Businesses will have incentive just to keep labor because they can pay them less rather than use expensive capital equipment or robots. Well, this technology is so powerful that even China, which is sort of the global center of where you go to get cheap labor, and where most of American manufacturing has fled in the past 30 years, or much of it, even China is now turning to robots increasingly in its factories. And some of their largest firms are anticipating a day in the not-too-distant future where Chinese factories will be significantly automated.
All right, let's you talk about Facebook, of course, bought Instagram versus Kodak. Let's talk about Facebook for a second, because 10 years ago or so, the company didn't exist. It's now worth over $300 billion. It has many employees. The entire real estate market in San Francisco is up sharply. It's created enormous wealth. Those people are out there buying properties and they're shopping and they're adding to the economy. So Facebook has become a giant company, and it has a lot of people working, and it's putting a lot back money into the economy. So where is that? There's a trade-off there. I mean, there's something going on. It's not like a failure. How do you factor that in?
Well, of course, if you're one of the handful of people who work for Facebook, and believe me, Facebook doesn't even remotely employ anyone compared to like what a large corporation used to do, like an AT&T or General Electric or General Motors. If you're one of the people who work at Facebook or you're a shareholder in Facebook, life is sweet. If you can afford to spend $20 million for a house in San Francisco in a nice neighborhood, and life is great. You're living in the most beautiful city in the world. You have no economic worries. That's wonderful. But let's not exaggerate it. That's not like 20% of the American population. And then it's too bad for the other 80%. That's not 2% of the American population. That's less than 1% that lives that idyllic life. And it's not going to increase at any time soon. It's a very, very small number. And we're coming to grips with the fact that this digital revolution has done more to increase inequality and monopoly than any other phenomenon in the history of capitalism in the last 200 years. If you look at that list of most valuable companies in the American economy, what you find is in terms of market value, the top three are companies like Google, Microsoft, Apple. And then right shortly after the list are Facebook and Amazon, and a couple of others. almost all the digital companies, these giants at the very top of the list, are huge, but they don't employ very many people relative to old-fashioned companies around them. And also you find there's no middle class of companies from number 50 to number 500 on the list. All the wealth accumulates to a very small number of monopolies. It's extremely concentrated. Network effects make it almost impossible for there to be competitive markets for the most part. So these handful of giants own everything. And for the giants themselves, of course, it's wonderful. Just like if you were a plantation owner in Mississippi in 1855, you were one of the richest people on earth relative to the population. Life looked fantastic in the big house to you. But, when you look at it from the perspective of the other 98% of the people in Mississippi then or in the United States today, life looks quite a bit the opposite. And it depends what perspective you want to take to make your analysis.
Yeah, no, let me jump in here. So, a lot of people equate the users of Facebook to kind of a modern day slavery situation where they're giving up all of their content and it's being monetized by a single monopoly position. But I want to, you cover politics and media, so I want to get your take on something here that's just developed over the past week or so. Facebook's been accused of skewing their content to have, to favor one political party or one political view over another. And Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, flew out, to meet up with conservatives. And so here you have a real interesting crossover between the new media, digital media, and politics, and this new sprawling plantation content farms, otherwise known as Facebook. What's your take on that? Is that for real? Is the politics being affected by this Facebook interaction? What do you think?
That's two shows in itself to do any justice to that question. What I can say is this. First of all, the crisis in journalism in America is that we don't have enough paid journalism for independent competing newsrooms that are uncensored. There's been a collapse in journalism in the United States in the last 25 years in terms of people being paid to do it and being accountable for beats because it's no longer commercially viable. And so Facebook's job is basically to aggregate, collect, and disseminate what journalism that exists. It doesn't create the journalism itself. It doesn't have newsrooms. And so it cannot do what isn't out there. It's not creating journalism itself. Now, the idea that its algorithm is entirely neutral is preposterous. It's impossible to do a neutral algorithm. It's going to have to make tough decisions about what goes first and what goes second and what goes third. Whether it favors one group or another, I'm in no position to say. But I will say this. What's striking is that Jeff Zuckerberg is very concerned when powerful interests complain about how they're being treated. But I doubt he is holding any meetings with Palestinian activists about how they're being treated, homeless activists, poor people, how they're being treated, the Green Party. Only squeaky wheels can get his attention. It's someone powerful that can affect his business model. So if there's anything, when you have a monopoly like Facebook, it's going to be very much part of the status quo and entrenched to satisfying those at the top. Because Facebook very much depends on having very favorable relationship with the government because it doesn't want the government investigating monopoly, raising its taxes, supporting labor unions, consumer rights, and most importantly, it doesn't want the government going after the surveillance capacity that Facebook's business model depends upon. And Facebook really doesn't want that to be threatened or challenged by the government.
All right, fair enough. We have about 2 minutes left. You write about this concept of citizenless democracy. We've got about 2 minutes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, that's what the United States is today. We are formally a democracy. We have elections. We're talking about them. We have the rule of law and a legal system. And technically, although this sounds like irony, we are equals before the law. And it's an egalitarian society before the law. Citizens are all equal in their rights and privileges and power. Of course, that isn't the case. And all the recent research, and we cited a great deal in People Get Ready, by our best political scientists shows that governance in the United States is made almost entirely to benefit commercial interests, wealthy, powerful interests. And then when the values of the American people, even the vast majority of Americans want one thing, but a self-interested corporate party wants something else, the corporate party will always win. It's not even debated. So we have a citizenless democracy. And what I argue with John Nichols and People Get Ready is the solution to the great economic problems we face and the environmental and social problems is making our democracy real again, creating the institutions, the infrastructure of democracy, getting the corruption and the money out, making it one person, one vote, having a genuine news media that's independent and uncensored and viable, so people actually do have the power to govern their own lives. And that's the great struggle of our times politically. And if we do that and accomplish that, we can solve all the economic and environmental and social problems before us that otherwise will seem virtually impossible to solve.
Right. Well, the public spaces where people gather to discuss these things are disappearing. The right to assemble is almost completely eliminated through the surveillance technology, and the time, what we have left to even go about organizing ourselves in this manner, it seems like it's almost past the point of no return. But we only have about 15 seconds left. Your thoughts on that quick comment?
Well, we're not past the point of no return. We're at the first inning of at least a 9-inning game, to use a baseball metaphor from the United States.
Fair enough. Okay, batter up. We're going to hit a grand slam home run. Robert McChesney, the Babe Ruth of political and economic analysis. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
My pleasure, Max.
All right, that's it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Robert McChesney, of this book. Go get his book. People, get ready to fight against a jobless economy and a citizenless democracy. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.